Today I'm going to talk about feeding soaked and steamed hay for horses. So hay makes up a significant portion of the horse's diet for those that are stalled for the majority of the day, or for horses with metabolic syndrome where grazing pasture may be prohibited. So why do we soak and why do we steam hay for horses? There are two main reasons that we do this, and they are reducing the allergens in the hay and also trying to reduce the non-structural carbohydrate content of the hay. So we soak and steam hay to reduce the allergens being dust, mold, and bacteria that can be present even in some of the really good quality hay. And we do this to help support the respiratory health of the horses. So horses can get equine asthma syndrome and have conditions of inflammatory airway disease and recurrent airway obstruction. And feeding hay, especially long stem dry hay, has been associated with a trigger for this. So it increases the amount of inhaled particles within their breathing zone. And this can be exacerbated by horses that are housed in barns with poor ventilation, or horses that are fed from hay nets or hay bags that hang up a little bit higher. The inhaled particles, the very small particles, can cause inflammation and increased mucus production, especially in the lower part of the airway. And this can increase the coughing and cause a decrease in performance and health of the horse. The other reason that we soak and steam hay is to try and change the nutrient content of the forage. And this is mainly the non-structural carbohydrate content, so starch plus water-soluble carbohydrates. And this would be for horses that have been diagnosed with metabolic syndrome or insulin dysregulation, requiring a low starch and sugar hay. And the recommendation for these horses is to feed a hay that has 10 to 12% NSC on a dry matter basis. And this can be hard for some horse owners to source, or it may be that the horse is very sensitive and needs further reductions in those water-soluble carbohydrates. And so we soak and steam hay. So how do we steam hay? There can be homemade setups like this one here in the corner, or there can be commercial products such as the Happy Horse or the Haygain steamer. But the premise is that we have a boiler unit that generates high temperature steam, and then this is forced through that hay bale, hopefully sterilizing the hay and reducing the amount of dust and mold and bacteria in that hay. So Haygain is probably the most researched and most popular or widely available commercial product that's used in performance horses. So the Haygain steamer, it has a commercial design. There is a lot of research behind this product, and the design makes it effective because it generates high temperature steam that is created throughout the duration of the steaming, and this is evenly distributed through the hay. So it's effective at going through the hay and not having areas where maybe there was no steam contact or the hay was closed off that can happen in those homemade setups. There is a lot of evidence behind using the Haygain as a steamer, and it's easy and practical to use in the barn. So some effects of steaming hay that we've seen in studies, we do see a reduced mold concentration, and it's very effective by reducing mold from 91 or greater percent compared to dry hay. And this in turn helps reduce the mucus production in horses. We also see a decrease in those potentially inhaled particles from 88 to 99%. The lower value of 88 was seen in a study using a homemade steaming device and 99 using a commercial product. So you can see there is a difference in their effectiveness. And steaming generally is considered to produce a hygienically clean hay. And using the steaming of the hay is one piece of the management protocol for horses with equine asthma syndrome. We're really trying to reduce or create a low dust environment for these horses. In steamed hay, we see minimal nutrient losses. So we don't see a lot of change in the dry matter, the protein, or the mineral content of hay versus dry hay once we've steamed. Studies have shown decreases in water-soluble carbohydrate. Some studies showed no change, whereas some studies saw a decrease in that sugar content by 18% compared to dry hay. So this may be appropriate for those metabolic horses, depending on the original sugar content of the hay, but it may not also be enough of a reduction for some horses. Studies have also shown that there is a preference in horses for dry or steamed hay, and this can be a benefit for those high performance horses. Increasing voluntary intake of hay can help increase energy intake and support digestive health. So how do we soak hay? There's no common method for soaking hay. Studies have compared the effects of soaking duration and water temperature. And soaking duration can change or range from 10 minutes of soaking to 16 hours and even greater in some studies. And the water temperatures investigated were cold or warm. And there was a range of temperatures there from 8 degrees Celsius up to 39 degrees Celsius. However, there's little information on what is the ideal amount of hay to soak per batch, and the amount of water needed remains unclear. However, it is recommended that that hay be submerged completely for the duration of the soaking to be effective. With that in mind, there are some current industry recommendations, and they are just to soak hay for 60 minutes in cold water, or to soak hay for 30 minutes in warm water. So the increase in water temperature allows you to have a reduction in the soaking duration. These are some ways that we can soak hay. So horse owners may buy a commercial product where they can put the hay in, add the water, let it soak, and then use the drain plug here at the bottom to let the water run out and drain itself. Other methods that have lower cost and input would be to soak in a container like this, a flake or two at a time, and fill that with water, let it soak. Commonly, we see people using hay nets, so they'll soak a larger volume of hay at a time. It's contained, so it's easier to soak and then also lift out of the water. There is a consideration of getting this to drain and then also handling the water that has been used to soak that. We don't want to feed that to other horses because obviously it has a lot of the dust and also some nutrient losses in that water, and that's something to consider practically. So some of the effects of soaking hay. Studies have shown that a short duration soak of about 10 minutes in cold water does significantly reduce those inhaled particles, so supporting respiratory health. Longer soaking times in the warmer water is more effective at reducing water-soluble content. However, nutrient losses with soaking in studies are highly variable, and we can also see some unintended nutrient losses with soaking. So we can have some protein loss, we can get losses of water-soluble carbohydrate ranging from 8 to 50% of the original content of dry hay. And we also can see some significant losses in the dry matter, so from 3 to nearly 30%. Obviously, that's due to an increase in moisture content. And then we also do see some mineral leaching with soaking hay, in particular phosphorus, magnesium, and potassium. Studies have shown that we can't really predict the extent of the nutrient losses based on the starting nutrient values of that hay or the type of hay or sort of water temperature or duration. So it is hard to make these predictions. Soaking hay does not guarantee that we're going to get a safe level of water-soluble carbohydrates or total starch and sugar in that forage for metabolic horses. And a recent study found that there was no difference in the glycemic response in feeding hays, even though we did get a reduction in NSC content of the hay when it was soaked. And that's interesting because we would assume that we are lowering that starch and sugar level in the hay, that the horse would have a lower blood glucose response to that forage, which is ideal for metabolic horses. This study was conducted in race horses, and that may explain why there was no difference observed, or the extent of the reduction in starch and sugar wasn't big enough. So when we soak hay and we see some of those reductions in water-soluble carbohydrates and dry matter, this causes an increase in some of the fiber fractions. So NDF, ADF, and lignin can be increased post-soaking. And generally, if we see this, we can see a decrease in the digestible energy of that forage due to the soaking. A study has seen soaking to be effective at reducing the nitrate levels in hay, and this was a high nitrate teff hay, and they found that soaking 1 to 8 hours was effective at bringing that level of nitrates down to an acceptable level for both horses and ruminants. On the flip side, if we soak hay for too long, so prolonged soaking can actually increase the risk of microbial contamination. So we see an increase in the number of bacteria in the hay. And this leads to the recommendation of feeding soaked hay within 2 hours. So we have a short feeding window. We may have to feed or soak multiple batches of hay throughout the day. So this can present management and practical implications. And the dry matter losses, when we see quite a drop in dry matter, this needs to be factored into the diet, especially when we're making recommendations for weight loss. We don't want to have further restrictions in dry matter intake that could have a negative impact on health. And with soaking, even though the goal is to reduce nutrient content, specifically water-soluble carbohydrates, we do see other nutrient losses that we need to correct for with a concentrate feed to make sure we're feeding a balanced diet. And the key is with soaking is to have a forage analysis of your hay before, so your dry hay, and then a representative sample of your post soaked hay to make sure that we are soaking and we're being effective with reducing water-soluble carbohydrates and knowing if we need to correct for any other nutrient losses. So sort of to sum up, some of the benefits and disadvantages of steaming and soaking hay. So steaming hay has several advantages. We have minimal nutrient losses, so we preserve the quality of the hay. We do see a reduction in the particles of dust, mold, and bacteria that could be inhaled. So it does support respiratory health. We can see an increase in voluntary intake. Practically, it requires a smaller volume of water to steam the hay, and we generate very little waste liquid. And the hay is likely to be more stable post-steaming than it is soaking, so we don't see that increase in bacteria as we do with soaked hay. Some of the disadvantages, though, it does require equipment. This could be a commercial product or a homemade setup. Commercial products do seem to be more effective, but they do have a large cost initially, and electricity is needed. So this may affect where you can steam the hay versus where the horses are being fed, and may be a limitation. So some of the benefits and disadvantages of soaking hay. So it's low cost equipment. You don't need a lot of equipment to soak hay. It is effective in reducing those dust particles or those inhaled particles with a short duration soak. And it does reduce soluble carbohydrates for those metabolic horses. It also reduces potassium content, which can be an advantage for horses with a condition called HYPP that requires a low potassium diet, and this can sometimes be a problem with certain forages. Some disadvantages of soaking hay: we get variable results. We also have losses of other nutrients, so protein and minerals, and it generates a large volume of waste liquid that we can't feed to horses or don't want to feed to the horses because it's highly concentrated with sugar, dust particles, mold spores. So we have to consider how to get rid of that. And there is a relatively small feeding time frame due to the risk of increasing in bacteria. So we may have to have multiple batches of hay soaked per day, and it is labor intensive. So draining the hay, lifting the hay out once it's been soaked can be quite heavy. And we also do see that some horses don't like soaked hay as well as they do dry or steamed, and this can reduce intake. That might not be a bad thing if we are trying to manage metabolic horses or overweight horses, would be detrimental if we're feeding high performance horses. So to summarize why we would soak or steam hay, if we're feeding soaked hay, it's likely because we're managing metabolic horses. We're trying to reduce the nutrient content of that forage, either water-soluble carbohydrates or maybe potassium. If we're feeding steamed hay, it's likely we have high-performance horses. We're trying to improve the hygienic quality of the hay, so reducing potentially inhaled particles, dust, mold, and to support the respiratory health for that performance horse. Or we may have a horse that suffers from equine asthma, and we need this to support their overall health and still maintain feeding a long stem hay. And that is all I have for today. Thank you.